Hi, 5th graders. Welcome to Lesson 1.3, Properties. The essential question for this lesson is, how can you use properties of operations to solve problems? Please turn in your Go Math workbook to Chapter 1, Lesson 3 on page 7, and let's get started. Now, as you can see on this next slide, I've included both the properties of addition and the properties of multiplication. You can use the properties of operations to help you evaluate numerical expressions more easily. As a review, you're going to see the commutative property of addition and also the commutative property of multiplication. And they just say that if the order of the add-ins or the factors changes, the product or the sum stays the same. You also have the associative property of addition and the associative property of multiplication. That's talking about the grouping. If the grouping of add-ins or factors changes, the sum or the product is still going to stay the same. And then last, you have the identity property of addition, which says the sum of any number in 0 is still going to be that number. It keeps its identity. And the identity property of multiplication says the product of any number in 1 is that number. So that number times 1 is still going to give you that number. It keeps its identity. Please use these properties to come back to review and use as needed as you're working homework or as we're working through the lesson together. Now, there's a new property that we're going to encounter in this lesson, and that property is called the distributive property. The distributive property simply says multiplying a sum by a number is the same as multiplying each add-in by the number and then adding the products. Let's look at an example. I see the problem 5 times 7 plus 9. Now, what that means to me and what helps me remember what to do is, I know that I have to distribute the 5. Now, first of all, I'm going to distribute the 5 to the 7. And in order to remind myself to do that, I'm going to draw an arrow from the 5 to the 7, from the factor to the first add-in. Now, along with multiplying the 5 by the 7, I also have to distribute the 5 to the 9. So it's 5 times 7 plus 5 times the 9. I have to multiply by the second add-in. So that becomes 5 times 7 plus 5 times 9. Now, I can also use the distributive property with multiplication and subtraction. For example, 2 times 10 minus 8 equals, now once again I'm going to draw my arrows, 2 times 10 minus 2 times 8. Now, let's look at question number 1 from the workbook. They give us the problem 6 times 89. Now remember, our job in this lesson is to use our properties to help us evaluate expressions more easily. 6 times 89 is not a very easy expression to evaluate mentally, which means in our head. But what they've done is this. They've taken 89 and turned it into two numbers that would be easy to work with. They've made it 90 minus 1. And listen, if I take 90 minus 1, I know that that gives me 89. Now, what's going to happen here is this. We're going to now use the distributive property to solve this problem. So what happens is I distribute the 6 to the 90, so it becomes 6 times 90, and then I'm going to distribute the 6 to the 1, so it becomes 6 times 1. Well, I can now very easily solve 6 times 90. That would take me to 540. Because 6 times 9 is 54, and I'm going to add my 0, so that's 540. And I know that 6 times 1 is going to give me 6, so if I have 540 minus 6, that takes me to an answer of 534. And I've now used my properties to help me evaluate that expression much more easily. Now, let's take a look at question number 2. Question 2 says to use properties to find the sum or product. And for question 2, they give me 93 plus, in parentheses, 68 plus 7. Well, I know that 68 and 7 are not numbers that work very well or very easily together. So I'm going to look at the other numbers in my problem, and I notice that I have a 93, and I also have a 7. And I know that if I add 7 and 3 together, it's going to take me to 10. So I know that those two numbers would be very easy to work out mentally. So I'm going to change the order of my problem. I'm going to write down 93 plus 7 plus 68. Now, when I change the order of my add-ins in this addition problem, that deals with the commutative property of addition. So that's changing the order, commutative property of addition. Now, I asked myself, what can I group together to finish out this problem? So I'm going to group the 93 plus 7 together and then add to that the 68. And when I talk about grouping, that deals with the associative property of addition. So I'm going to just jot down over to the side that that is the associative property of addition being shown. Now, I'm going to add 93 plus 7, and when I add 93 plus 7, that takes me to 100, and that's a very easy problem to work in my head. So I'm now going to add to that 100 my 68, and when I add 168 together, my answer turns out to be 168. So I've now used my properties to find the sum of this addition problem. Now, let's look at question number 4. The directions say once again to use properties to find the sum or product. For question 4, the problem is 8 times 51, so I know I'm going to be finding a product. Now, when I look at the problem 8 times 51, that's not a very simple problem for me to solve mentally. So what I ask myself is there a way that I could break apart that 51? So let's think about this. If I were to break apart the 51, I could break it apart as 50 plus 1. Now that I have 50 plus 1, those would be two very easy numbers for me to work with mentally. So I'm now going to rewrite my problem as 8 times 50 plus 1. Now, my next step is going to illustrate that new property that we're dealing with in this lesson, and it's the distributive property. So what I know is I now have to distribute my 8 to the 50. So I'm going to draw my arrow to show that. So it becomes 8 times 50. But then I also know that I have to distribute my 8 to the 1. So it's 8 times 50 plus 8 times 1. Now that I have it to this step, I now have two multiplication problems that are very easy to solve mentally. I know that 8 times 5 is 40, and if I add a 0, that takes me to 400. So 8 times 50 is going to give me 400. And I know that 8 times 1 is going to give me 8. Now when I add 400 plus 8, the product turns out to be 408. Now, let's take a look at question number 7. The directions for question number 7 say complete the equation and tell which property you used. When I look at question number 7, on the first side of the equation, I see in parentheses 3 times 10 times 8, and that's equal to blank times, in parentheses, 10 times 8. Now I know that I can use logical reasoning to determine that I'm missing the 3 on this side of the equation. So I'm going to plug my 3 in order to complete the equation. Now I'm going to ask myself, what property is being used? So when I look at this problem, I notice first of all that on the first side of the equation, the 3 and the 10 are grouped together. And on the second part of the equation, I notice that the 10 and the 8 are grouped together. So when we're talking about grouping, that deals with the associative property. So I'm going to write down associative property. Now I look back at my problem, and the problem involves multiplication. So it's the associative property of multiplication that's being illustrated. Now, what I do want to point out is that on either side of the equal sign, both of the expressions must have the same value. So when I look at the first part, or the first side of this equation, I know that when I multiply 3 times 10, that's going to give me 30. So I'm going to write down 30. And I know that I've got to now multiply the 30 times the 8. When I multiply 30 times 8, that takes me to 240. Now on the other side of the equation, I see in parentheses 10 times 8. When I multiply 10 times 8, that's going to give me 80. So I'm going to write down the 80, and I know that I have to multiply that by the 3. When I multiply 3 times 80, that also takes me to 240. Now, let's take a look at question number 9. The directions once again say complete the equation and tell which property you used. When I look at question number 9, I see 0 plus blank equals 91. Now I can once again use my logical reasoning to determine that in that equation the missing number should be a 91. So I'm going to write in my 91. Now, when I focus on that problem, I see a 0. And I know that if I see that 0 in that addition problem, I'm dealing with the identity property. So I'm going to write down identity property. And when I look back at my problem, I know that it has addition in it. So it's the identity property of addition that's being used. And what the identity property of addition says is it says that the sum of any number and 0 is still going to be that number. So once again, 0 plus 91 equals 91. Now, let's check out problem number 11. This is one of our real-world problem-solving questions. It says, the Metro Theater has 20 rows of seats with 18 seats in each row. Tickets cost $5. The theater's income in dollars, if all seats are sold, is 20 times 18 in parentheses times 5. Use properties to find the total income. So I'm going to write down what's given. I have 20 times 18 in parentheses times 5. Well, if I'm going to solve what's in parentheses first, I'm looking at 20 times 18, and that's not a very easy problem to solve mentally. So I asked myself, is there a way that I could change things around or put numbers together that would make it much easier to solve mentally? And what I see is I have a 20 and I have a 5. And I know that those numbers would be two numbers to work with very easily. So I'm going to now rewrite this as 20 times 5 times 18. And when I change the order of the factors in a multiplication problem, that illustrates the commutative property. Now, I'm going to rewrite this, and I'm now going to group my 20 times 5 together times the 18. And when I talk about grouping or changing the grouping, that now deals with the associative property. Now when I look at what I have, I know that 20 times 5 is a problem that I can work out very easily using mental math. 20 times 5 is going to give me 100, and now I have to multiply that 100 times 18. Well, what I know is 1 times 18 is going to give me 18, and I'm left with 2 zeros to add on to that. So 100 times 18 is going to give me $1,800 as my answer. Now, let's take a look at question number 12. It's another one of our real-world problem-solving questions, and it says, the numbers of students in the 4 6th grade classes at Northside School are 26, 19, 34, and 21. Use properties to find the total number of students in the 4 classes. Now, what I notice in this problem is, it says find the total number of students. And I know that when I see the word total, I'm going to need to add my numbers together. So I'm going to write down 26 plus 19 plus 34 plus the 21. Now when I look at that problem, I know that it's not very easy to compute this problem using mental math the way that it's written. So I start thinking, how could I rearrange this problem so it would be an easy problem to solve using mental math? Well, I notice that I have a 26 and I have a 34. And I know that when I add 4 plus 6, that takes me to 10. So I know that I could put those numbers together. So I'm going to rewrite this as 26 plus 34 plus 19 plus 21. Now, when I change the order of my add-ins, that deals with the commutative property of addition. So I'm going to write down commutative property. Now I think to myself, how can I now group these numbers together? Well, I know that I'm going to group together my 26 and my 34, because once again, 4 and 6 work well together. But when I look here, I can also group together my 19 and my 21, because I know that 1 and 9 work well together. Now, when I talk about the grouping of the add-ins, that deals with the associative property of addition. So I'm going to jot down over here that I'm using the associative property. Now, I'm going to continue solving this problem using mental math. I know that when I add 26 plus 34, that takes me to 60. And when I add 19 plus 21, that takes me to 40. So when I add 60 plus 40 together, that's going to give me an answer of 100. So I know that there are 100 students in the 4 classes, and I've used my properties to help me solve that problem. Okay guys, here are your homework questions for tonight. I would like you to complete questions 1 and 2, and then I also want you to complete questions 3 through 6 on your own, please. You'll find your homework questions on page 8 in your Go Math workbook. Now, don't forget, somewhere on your homework page, I want you to make sure that you assess yourself. Are you number 1, a novice, number 2, an apprentice, number 3, a practitioner, or number 4, an expert? Now, don't forget, your homework questions for tonight are numbers 1 and 2, and then also numbers 3 through 6, found on page 8 in your Go Math workbook. I hope you guys have a great evening, and I'll see you tomorrow in class.